Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the All Me podcast. My name is Don Hooten Jr., and today I'll be your host. We have a very special guest with us today who needs no introduction. He's an American sportscaster who has received numerous Emmy Awards for his work. He's been the primetime host for 11 Olympic Games, and in 2018 was inducted into the Sports Broadcasting Hall of Fame. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking with the legendary Bob Costas. Throughout his Hall of Fame career, Bob has always been outspoken and has taken a strong stance against doping in sport. In this podcast, you're going to get a better understanding as to why he feels as though who have used appearance and performance-enhancing substances didn't have authentic results. I'll also have a chance to ask Bob about things outside of sports. So you're also going to hear about some of the items on his bucket list, as well as which song he'd choose if he were a Major League Baseball player stepping up to the plate. We can't thank him enough for all of his support that he's provided the Taylor Hooten Foundation over the years. The All Me podcast wouldn't be possible without the support we receive from our partners at Gatorade. A big thanks to Gatorade for all of their support. Please be sure you hit subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to give us a rating. It will help us impact more lives. Let's bring on Hall of Fame sportscaster, Mr. Bob Costas. Bob Costas, welcome to the Taylor Hooten Foundation's All Me podcast. We're excited to talk with you today.
Don, how are you?
I am doing great. All things considered, life's wonderful. How about you?
Well, you got to put in that stipulation, all things considered, because we're living in strange times. But as I said, or someone actually said to me at the outset of this months and months ago, some of us are fortunate. We just have to adapt to these circumstances. Other people are trying in one sense or another to survive. So there isn't a day that goes by that I don't consider myself among the most fortunate people. But this is a difficult situation in one way or another for all of us, because we have to, at the very least, adapt to circumstances we never thought we'd find ourselves in.
You're certainly right. It was quite challenging from us early on, as you know, we deliver programs nationwide in schools, and we're delivering them assembly style. So travel virtually came to a halt, and we moved everything over to Zoom, which was a platform we've been using to record podcasts for a while. And now today, what we're basically doing is taking over classrooms for a teacher for a day, which has been wonderful. So we're able to reach a bunch of students. But, you know, we're really excited, and I've got a lot of questions for you. And I just want to first thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join us for this interview. So let's dive right in. Your sportscasting career started while you were attending Syracuse University when you were announcing for the Syracuse Blazers, which is a minor league hockey team. Was interviewing and broadcasting a talent that you realized you had early on in life?
Well, I didn't know for sure until at least a few years in at Syracuse University, and even then I didn't know what level of ability I might have. It was more difficult then to make recordings of yourself. Now everybody has a recording device in effect in their pocket with their smartphone. When I was 15, 16 years old, my parents bought me a tape recorder for Christmas. But then what that meant was a somewhat cumbersome reel-to-reel thing where you had to thread the tape through these two kind of rotating discs, and it wasn't something you could carry around all that easily. But I would sit in front of the television, sometimes turn the sound down, and try and broadcast the ball game off the TV. And then when I heard it back, I said to myself, wow, this is a long way from even the least impressive announcer I've heard on real radio or real television. Not just the flow and what I was saying, but how thin and immature my voice sounded, which was, I guess, natural. I was 15, 16 years old. I knew I wanted to do it. I didn't know for sure if I'd be able to do it. Syracuse University then and now had a very prestigious public communications and journalism school. But in the early 1970s, they were so far ahead of the curve, Now almost every university has, to one extent or another, a program of its own. But then Syracuse was way ahead with the Newhouse School of Public Communications. Most universities then thought of journalism as just old school print journalism, which is still very important. But Syracuse had radio and television facilities that 90% of the commercial stations in the country would have envied. And most important, they let students run the campus radio station. So we went on there and tried our hand at it. And I tried to do everything, the news, the weekend weather, music shows, but especially sports. And I was on the air by a month into my freshman year, and we would sit around other aspiring broadcasters, like-minded kids, and that was important, to be in an atmosphere where people have similar ambitions and interests, and you kind of play off of each other. And we'd review our tapes and critique ourselves and each other mercilessly. And even though, to honestly answer your question, Don, even though I knew that I wasn't nearly as good as I one day hoped to be, there were a handful of us that were noticeably better than the other kids. So I knew that I had at least some ability. How far it would take me and how well I could hone it and refine it, I didn't know for sure. But one thing I can say looking back, and I say this to all aspiring young broadcasters, you want to get as well-rounded an education as you can. You want to be an interesting person. Even if you become a sportscaster as you hope, you want to have a frame of reference that makes you a more interesting and textured person. But having said that, you cannot learn to be a broadcaster in a classroom. The only way you can learn how to do it and find out, if you're honest with yourself, whether you really have the knack to do it, is by actually doing it. So any chance you get to be on the air, no matter what it is, even if it's not the thing you ultimately want to wind up doing, take that chance. The more reps you get, the further along you'll be. And also, if you're honest with yourself, the better able you will be to say, I do or don't have this particular knack or this particular ability. And there are so many jobs in broadcasting, sports and otherwise, beyond being on the air. Lots of the best people in the business are names that the public doesn't know, but they're producers, they're directors. The answer to your question is that I knew I was pretty good, or at least had a shot, by the time I was a sophomore in college, but I also knew I had a very long way to go.
I think that's great advice, because I'll never forget when I first came to work for the foundation, our board of directors, at the time I was in the real estate business, and asked me to come work for the foundation full time. And I had taken some public speaking classes and some business classes and had a good understanding of how businesses work. But I'll never forget the first program I ever had where I had to go share my brother's story. It was a private school in New York. There were 2,000, it was all boys, so 2,000 boys. I'm on the stage. And my dad told me the only way you're going to get good at public speaking, or even figure out if it's something you can do, is you just have to go do it. And I'll never forget the way I felt on the stage. And probably the same way you felt when you started broadcasting, is you just kind of get comfortable. You got to have fun. You've got to find a way to relax and connect with the audience. And here we are, 15 years later, still doing it. So I think that's great advice. Is it true when you were hired by NBC Sports in 1980 that the late Don Ohlenmeyer said that you looked like you were 14 years old?
Yeah, that's true. I was 27 when they hired me, and shortly after I began doing broadcasts for them, maybe 2 or 3 months in, he actually called me into his office, and he praised my work. He said, "You have a future here, but let me ask you something. How old are you?" Well, I'm 27. And he said, "Damn it, you look like you're 14. And then he said, "How much older do you think you would look if you grew a beard?" And I said, 5 years at least. And he perked up. He said, 5 years, really? I said, yeah, because that's how long it would take to grow it. So that was the end of that idea.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine somebody telling me, but hey, you look back and that's got to be a compliment.
Yeah, I guess at the time, I guess, I think even when I hosted my first Olympics late night in 1988, I was 36. And then 4 years later, I became the primetime host in Barcelona in 1992. I was 40. And even then, if people weren't familiar with me and hadn't watched me over the years, if this was the first time they saw me, they might have guessed that I was in my mid to late 20s. not much you can do about it. It's the genetic hand you've been dealt, for better or worse.
It's certainly great genetics, because you meet some of these guys that are in their 20s or in 30s. They look like they're in their 40s or 50s. So I guess it's better to be on the other end.
Yeah, all things considered, I'll take option 2.
Exactly. Silver lining. So, you've done it all in your Hall of Fame career. You've been on TV. You've had your own radio show. You've gotten to travel the globe and watch sports on their biggest stages. You've been in the movies. You've done voiceovers for cartoons like The Simpsons and The Family Guy. Having had the opportunity to be a part of all media and to watch some of the biggest sport events ever in the history of the world, what do you think the most memorable moment that you've had in your career?
It could be a 20 or 30-way tie for first, because I've been so lucky and have been at the scene of so many memorable moments. When I'm forced to pick just one, I always pick the same one. It's Muhammad Ali lighting the torch at the opening ceremony of the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. It was a goosebump-raising moment. It was a complete surprise to 99.9% of the people even involved in the Olympics, let alone people watching at home or in the stadium. Dick Enberg and I were hosting the opening ceremony. We did not know who the last torchbearer would be. We knew who all the preceding torchbearers were, because you have to have at least some kind of note on each of them. But Dick Ebersol, who ran NBC Sports then, told Dick Enberg and me, "I'm not going to tell you who he or she is. I want your reaction to be just as spontaneous and genuine as people watching at home, but I'll guarantee you this: you will know who he or she is as soon as they take the torch." And so Dick and I might have had some ideas running through our head as to who it would be, but we didn't know for sure until Muhammad Ali stepped out of the shadows and took the torch from the great swimmer Janet Evans. And I do think I've been part of a dozen Olympics, and I do think that that's the one moment among all the many, many memorable moments. That's the one that stands out the most.
Wow, that's just fascinating, especially just like you said, out of every moment that you've had to see in sports. And you've broadcasted just about every sport, from the Olympics to the NBA to Major League Baseball. What's your favorite sport to broadcast?
Baseball has always been my favorite sport in every respect. I like basketball very much, too. I loved my time on the NBA on NBC, and it was a golden era, the Michael Jordan era in the NBA at the beginning, and then in the middle, Hakeem Olajuwon's Rockets won a couple of titles back-to-back, and then at the back end of our run with the NBA, it was the three-peat for the Lakers with Kobe and Shaq. So it was a wonderful era, and that's a close second for me. But baseball overall has always been first. And when it comes to the Olympics, I don't mean to slight the Olympics, but the Olympics is not just one sport. It's dozens and dozens of different disciplines at an Olympics, at a Summer Olympics. It's 10,000 plus athletes. And yes, it's a sports event, but it's also a cultural panorama. It's a travel log. It's an entirely different thing. So I don't slight the Olympics when I cite baseball and basketball first, but the Olympics are in a category of their own.
It's fascinating watching broadcasters work. And, one of the very memorable times I've had as of recently, we were at spring training, and we were at the Pirates spring training camp there in Florida. And we were watching Greg Brown announce one of the games, and he's writing stuff down. He's looking at a computer screen. He's also calling the balls and strikes. And I'm just sitting to myself, my brain just doesn't operate like that. So it's fascinating to hear how you can just jump into any of these sports and be able to announce them. Speaking about sports, and I want to turn kind of the table real quick and get into doping. Because as you know, for many years, doping has been a big issue in sport. It's something that we speak out about. It's something we've spoken out about. And our primary focus really is on the youth of this country and around the world and their adult influencers. But you've always been one of those guys who has spoken out against it. Why are you so outspoken against doping in sport?
Well, no matter what goes on around sports, and no league, no sports enterprise is perfect, even at best, because after all, it involves human beings, and human beings are flawed. But the one thing that sports needs to have going for it, no matter what else happens, is a belief in the integrity and authenticity of the competition itself. if you can't believe in the authenticity of the competition, you might as well just go watch pro wrestling. At the core, that's what it has to be. Sometimes, and it doesn't make any difference how clearly you express yourself, sometimes people look at the discussion around performance-enhancing drugs as if we're talking about a moral issue, which it is in some respects, an issue of criminality, which in some respects it can be. But to me, the most important thing is the issue of authenticity. I'm not looking to pass moral judgment on baseball players who we know or strongly suspect use performance-enhancing drugs. But I am saying that if you ask me, are Barry Bonds' late career performances authentic? No, they are not. Is Mark McGwire's 70 homers authentic? No. Sammy Sosa's 3 seasons with 60-plus homers authentic? No. I'm not looking to flog them in the public square. I'm not looking to say they're bad human beings because of that. But I am saying that those performances are not genuine. Somehow, there are people out there that can't make that distinction. And they also offer ridiculous counter-arguments. And I know we're going to get to the moral aspect of this in a bit, Don, and especially as it relates to young people using performance-enhancing drugs, which is a different thing. But just to finish up this thought, there are people who will say, well, what about amphetamines? Many Hall of Famers used greenies in the 1960s and 70s. Yes, they did. And please tell me, where's the massive distortion in norms of performance for those Hall of Fame players? Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle, if he used them, whomever, they were at the top of the pyramid in terms of performance, but did they do things that previously were unheard of in baseball history? No, Hank Aaron's hitting 40 home runs, 43 home runs, whatever it was, every year, and it was just consistently great. There was a cluster of performances in the 90s and early 2000s that defied belief, that turned baseball into a video game. And all the players involved had previous established levels of performance. So they not only exceeded the norms of past baseball history, including for Hall of Famers, they exceeded their own established levels of performance to an extent that had no other possible explanation. Plus, I also point out that amphetamines were also widely used at that time. So amphetamines combined with a whole panoply of performance-enhancing drugs. You just can't put that in the same category. Amphetamines are a performance enabler, by and large, allowing you to feel close to as fresh day game following a night game in August as you did on the first day of the season. Whereas steroids are a performance, not just a performance enhancer, steroids transform people and distort the nature of the competition. That's just obvious by evidence. And when other people, look, we live in a world where people believe a lot of ridiculous things that are not supported by evidence just because they want to believe it. So I don't want to see Barry Bonds do a perp walk. I don't want to see these guys written out of baseball history. But I do want to have an understanding of how these performances should be evaluated. They are not authentic. Does this make them bad human beings? No. Some of the best people in terms of being a nice guy use steroids. And some people who aren't such nice guys didn't. But when it comes to, are these performances genuine? No, they're not.
I think that's a great perspective. And one of the perspectives we also try, to get across to people is, especially as it relates to professional athletes. I can tell you, we've talked to everything, from amateur athletes to high school athletes, even to high school students, all the way up to professional athletes. And when the opportunity comes up to talk to a professional athlete, it's like, look, put yourself back, as a little kid sitting in front of that TV or playing your video game, just wanting to emulate these players. And when you make a decision like that to use performance-enhancing drugs, and it comes out in the media, it always does, it's the message that it's sending to those young kids that in order for them to achieve that same goal you did, they've got to follow in those footsteps. And whether that's the truth or not is a whole nother argument. But that is a very poor message that we send to our young people. And I think it's something that, we need to continue to talk about and let these athletes know that you have a lot of young eyeballs that are looking at you.
Yeah, the whole idea of whether or not athletes are role models, you can make a Charles Barkley type case that you should look to your parents, your teachers, people close to you in your life as influencers. They should be your role models. And what we ask of athletes is an honest performance and try and keep your name off the police blotter. And if athletes do more than that, if they are admirable in some respects beyond that, then that's a bonus. Okay, fair enough as far as it goes. But when it comes to athletic performance, who else do we look to as our role models? No matter what the discipline is, whether it's something in show business or whether you want to be a writer or an academic, you look to people who are the very best at what they do. So you can't escape, if you're an athlete, to your point, Don, you can't escape the idea that you are a role model and you are being watched when it comes to your performance and perhaps how you have attained that performance. So there is a ripple effect. And while I'm not an expert on this, I've tried to educate myself, and it's pretty clear that world-class level athletes, even as they're cheating, if you got, just as one example, if you got your drug regimen from Balco, and if you had a high-end trainer, your life and health are not likely to be in serious jeopardy. But if you're a 15, 16-year-old kid who on his own is sneaking around using PEDs, using anabolic steroids, whether it's just to look better at the beach or whether it's to get stronger for the next football or baseball season, then it is somewhat more likely that that's going to jeopardize your health because you're not doing it under the supervision of someone with medical expertise. Even if they're a rogue chemist or whatever, they have some level of expertise, and you're also dealing with physically mature people at a different stage of their lives. So this is even more of a roll of the dice if you're talking about kids in their teens who are doing it on their own.
You're absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought up the whole point of role models. And, a lot of people ask, what's the genesis behind All Me? And we've got a whole bunch of podcast episodes about it. But it really came to fruition when we were working with Alex Rodriguez. And if you remember, the second time Alex was implicated, we had a relationship with Alex where Alex was very generous, with financial contributions, of which we were able to do hundreds of programs with him, some without him, but all around the country. And when he was implicated the second time, we obviously had to cut ties with Alex, and we didn't want to become the organization that professional athletes came to rehabilitate their image because, let's face it, there's hundreds, and the vast majority of athletes are doing it the right way. And that's sort of how All Me was born. And we reached out to Commissioner Seelig and his team at the time and said, we would like to reach out to all 30 teams and ask that one player voluntarily step forward to be a role model and join this MLB advisory board, is what we were calling it. And I just remember kind of at winter meetings laughing, and, we just figured if we got 5 or 6 guys, we'd be super successful. And today, Bob, we've got 41 Major League Baseball players that represent all 30 Major League teams, one of which is Clayton Kershaw that just won his first World Series.
Mm-hmm. It's a shame about Alex, to backtrack just a little bit.
Yeah.
Alex has a number of laudable characteristics, and he also made some terrible mistakes and dishonesty, quite honestly, if I can use both words in the same sentence, was part of it. Who knows what the exact motivation was, but it's laudable that he helped you out the way he did, but it's going to be part of his obituary, if he lives to be 100, part of his obituary that one of the truly greatest players on his natural merits in Major League history also broke the rules. And he broke the rules after they were codified, which makes a difference in the minds of many. Look, everybody knew it was wrong in the 80s and 90s. It's against federal law to use steroids unless there's a specific medical indication for it. Everybody knew it was wrong and it was cheating. Otherwise, people who try to rationalize it now and say, oh, there were no rules against it. Well, if there were no rules against it, it was perfectly okay. Why didn't people just in 1992 say, sure? Yeah. Why not? This is what I do.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I hit 65 home runs just because this is what I do. What's your problem? No different than taking a multiple vitamin.
Exactly.
Everybody knew it was wrong. But then baseball finally, after the congressional hearings in 2005 at which your dad testified, after all of that, finally, under pressure, the Players Association came around and they codified testing and penalties. And Alex and others ran afoul of that after that regimen was already put in place. So that casts it in an even different light.
Do you think that there is an ultimate solution that would curb the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sport?
I'm smart enough to know the problem and the history. I'm not smart enough to have a blanket solution. There's a risk-reward thing there. And the rewards are so large in professional sports, whether it's the difference between being, as we confine it to baseball, a minor leaguer or a fringe major leaguer, pension benefits and whatnot, to go from the bench to the starting lineup, from the starting lineup to the All-Star team, from the All-Star team to the Hall of Fame. The incentives are there, and it's a cliche, but it's true. The cheaters are often ahead of the drug police. Mm-hmm. It would be very naive to say that there are not athletes using performance-enhancing drugs now, but they have to be more sophisticated about it. Mm-hmm. And what I think we can plainly say is this: the over-the-top stuff, the stuff that turns you into a cyborg, Decadurabolin and Winstrol and all the rest that guys were using with impunity in the 90s and early 2000s, that's going to trip a drug test every time now. So do I think that PEDs are out of baseball, just as one example? Of course not. Do I think that their use has been curtailed and that those who are using drugs of less potency? Yeah, I believe that.
Many people have said that they believe a lifetime ban for first offense when caught using PEDs would help stop doping in sport. What's your opinion on a lifetime ban for a first-time offender?
I think that's too harsh because justice has to be tempered by mercy. Plus, as a practical matter, when you're talking about professional sports, you have players' associations that would resist that. But I would have no problem whatsoever with the idea that you get a full season ban for the very first, and that means if you're caught on July 16th, it's until July 16th of the following year. And for teams having the right at their own discretion to say, we signed this person with the expectation that they were clean. And so it's a breach of contract. If he's got a 5-year deal and in the second year he was caught, we are not liable to honor the last 3 years of the contract, but they can if they want to. That's up to the team. And the player isn't banned from baseball after that first offense. He can go back into the market as a free agent and see if any team wants to give him a chance. But the first team can, at its own discretion, decide to live up to or waive what remains on the contract. And I don't have a problem with a lifetime ban for a second offense.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting point. And I want to kind of move to an Olympic discussion that became a big documentary. It was a big talk, and that's the 2014 Sochi Olympics. And you were right in the mix of things during those Olympics while this state-sponsored Russian doping scandal was taking place. And there's many, believe it or not, that really aren't familiar with this scandal. And essentially, the Russians were swapping out dirty urine samples with clean ones in order to skate the system. And oftentimes, this was done by passing samples through holes that were made in the wall. What is your take on the doping scandal? And do you think that, folks like the World Anti-Doping Agency, the IOC, the International Athletic Federation, and other anti-doping leaders around the world took the right position on banning them from competition?
Yeah, you got to remember, the IOC is pretty cozy with authoritarian regimes. There'll be a Winter Olympics in 2022 in Beijing, COVID allowing. And that means that in the space of less than 20 years, actually 14 years, they will have had a Summer Olympics and a Winter Olympics in China. And we know what the problems are, not just in terms of sports, but up and down in terms of human rights and whatnot in China. They go to Sochi. You have to say that Vladimir Putin made it easy for them. They pulled off an Olympics with precision. The security issues were taken care of. Authoritarian regimes have a way of getting people in line and taking care of some of these considerations that are more daunting in free and open societies. The IOC doesn't want to come down too hard on Russia because they're an important part of the business model of the IOC. But they are so blatant and so shameless. And what they did in Sochi, right under the noses of the IOC, was almost astonishing, even knowing the amoral stance that Russia takes toward these things. So there was some harsh penalties. There were athletes who could prove that they were clean, who were allowed to participate in the next Olympics under the Olympic banner, but not the banner of Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And they'll be watched more closely going forward. But there's no way that they're going to be banned indefinitely from the Olympics because they're too important to them commercially.
Did you have an opportunity to see the documentary Icarus?
Yes.
I thought it was very well done. You know, my wife obviously has lived through a lot of the, you know, what I do for a living. And we had a chance to sit down. Everybody's like, have you had a chance to look at it? I was like, summer times are really hard. We're doing a lot of work with baseball. We're traveling. We're visiting schools. And I finally had a chance to sit down. Her and I just watched that documentary. And it's just unbelievable the lengths they went to cheat and that somebody would want you. I mean, you feel bad for the athletes too, that, you know, that because it was all state sponsored and all that sort of stuff, but very eye-opening documentary.
Yeah. And state sponsored is the key. No one thinks that just because we're the United States of America, that all of our athletes are clean. No, many U.S. athletes in the Olympics have used performance enhancing drugs. Some have been busted. Some have been among the most popular. I think Marion Jones is just one example who was involved with Balco and other Olympic athletes during that era. But the difference is that in countries like Russia or the old Soviet Union Eastern Bloc, and we can wonder about China, you've got state-sponsored sports machines. They have the means and the motivation to cheat in a sophisticated fashion, although I'm not sure how sophisticated it is to drill a hole in the wall and then and slip a urine sample. I mean, were the guards asleep? Were they drugged?
That's what I want to know.
That's just ridiculous. That's like saying that the Astros had a sophisticated system. They banged on a trash can with a bat, but they got away with it at least for a while.
I guess it's the simplest things that work.
In some cases, yes. So the state-sponsored aspect of it puts it in an entirely different light.
So you had mentioned the 2005 congressional hearings, that were the hearings on steroids in Major League Baseball. And my father had an opportunity. I'll never forget, him going to those hearings and testifying and seeing him on C-SPAN, just before we heard from Schilling, Palmeiro, Canseco, Sosa, and even Mark McGwire. And it was following those hearings that, we partnered with Major League Baseball. In fact, Commissioner Seelig called my dad, and we had a whole podcast on this, but my dad hung up on Commissioner Seelig thinking it was a joke. And, so they keep in touch today, and it's still, something they talk and they laugh about. But because of those hearings, Major League Baseball has been our primary sponsor. And because of that, we've directly impacted over 2 million lives around the world. Now, you had a chance to interview Mark McGwire about his steroid use, which I've watched a few times. And one of the things that he said was it was one of the hardest days of his life. And you were in the room with him, doing that interview. Do you think Mark was sincere about that confession using anabolic steroids and truly regretted the decision that he made?
Yes, but I think he was conflicted. And to this day, he cannot acknowledge that he got any benefit from it other than recovery from injuries and being able to endure a long and grinding season. He just believes that whatever PEDs he used were performance enablers, not performance enhancers. And that had he been healthy, he would have done pretty much what he did. That just defies belief and common sense. They're called performance-enhancing drugs because they enhance performance. Is Mark McGwire a good guy in the big picture? Yeah, I think he's a very good guy. Could he have been a Hall of Famer in kind of the Harmon Killebrew mode, a real slugger, 260, 270 hitter, real slugger, high on base percentage because he'd walk a lot? Could he have had 50-plus home run seasons if everything went well? Sure, he could have. But nobody has that level of performance without using performance-enhancing drugs. And the proof of that is that the three guys at the top of that PED pyramid in baseball, Bonds, McGwire, Sosa, all convincingly, undeniably linked to performance-enhancing drugs in that same cluster of seasons, and each putting up video game type numbers. So Mark is in denial. Does that mean I think Mark is a bad guy? No, I think he's a good guy. And I think that he worked hard at being a baseball player. You don't just take steroids and sit on the couch. That's another one of those stupid arguments. When people say, well, steroids can't help you hit a baseball. Of course they can. Barry Bonds and Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire couldn't hit a baseball before they used steroids. Yeah. Or it doesn't help with bat speed. Of course it does.
Yes.
If steroids only increase strength, then the only Olympic athletes who took steroids would be shot putters and weightlifters. Why do sprinters take it? Fast twitch muscle fiber. If you can wait a split second longer on a pitch to identify it, to swing or to lay off of it, then that makes a huge difference. Why was Barry Bonds, one of the most naturally gifted players ever, a first-rank Hall of Famer on his natural merits, why was he even better in his mid to late 30s? I'll tell you why. Performance-enhancing drugs. So anyone who says otherwise is as much in denial as people who say, we don't know yet the outcome of the election. You want to live on another planet? You want to report from Jupiter? Go ahead.
Exactly. And the other piece is, it's typically, as you know, Bob, as we get older, our performance goes down. And with some of those guys, you just saw it get better and better and better each year. And it's just like, how is that possible? How is it happening?
Steroids.
So baseball, I know from reading you and talking with Gene Gieselman, who, by the way, told me to tell you hello. He's such
a
great
guy.
I love Gene. Can't wait to, for all this COVID mess to be gone so I can see him again. But baseball is a sport that you love, you're passionate about. I think Gene even told me, we were talking last week, you used to keep, or maybe you still do, a Mickey Mantle baseball card in your billfold.
Yeah.
Is that true? Do you still do it?
The first Mickey Mantle card I ever got when I was a kid collecting Topps bubblegum cards, the first year I remember doing it, I was 6 years old, 1958, and you wanted to get a Mickey Mantle or a Willie Mays or a Ted Williams or Stan Musial. They were still active then. So those were the cards that you cherished. And growing up in New York, I was a Yankee fan. I was a Mickey Mantle fan. So like a lot of kids, for years and years, you got shoeboxes filled with your baseball cards, which you didn't collect as a monetary investment. You collect them for emotional and sentimental value. And on a rainy day, you'd rearrange them by position, by league, by how you evaluated them. So when I went away to college, this happened. Many kids tell you this story of lament. Your mom cleans out the closet. You don't need these anymore. Out they go. Yeah. But luckily, the 1958 Mantle survived the purge. So just kind of tongue-in-cheek, I began saying, well, it'd be a sacrilege to throw this away. So I always carried it around, kind of as, a talisman, a good luck, a token of good luck. And when Tony Kubek, who had played with Mickey Mantle on the Yankees in the 50s and 60s and was my broadcast partner on NBC in the 80s, when he saw it one time, he mentioned it on the Game of the Week. And then Sports Illustrated wrote a short story about it. After that, and ever since, when I'm out in public, which happens less during COVID times, but when I'm out in public, it's very common for a stranger to say, "Hey, Bob, do you have the Mantle card?" So I don't want to disappoint anybody. So whether I'm wearing a suit or whether I'm just in a jeans and T-shirt going out to get a cup of coffee, I always make sure I have it with me just in case somebody asks.
That's really cool. Now, in the couple of minutes that we have left, Bob, I want to toss a couple of curveball questions to you because it's kind of a staple of our show and really has not too much to do with your career and yourself, but more to get to know you personally. But knowing what you know now, if you could go back and do something other than broadcasting, what would it be?
You know, I have no idea what I would have enough aptitude for that would lead to making a comfortable living. I think if I had been born a century plus ago, when there was no radio and no television, I'd be the village idiot or something. I have no idea what I'd be, a ward of the state. I have no idea what it would be. My mom always used to think that I would have made a good trial lawyer, opening and closing arguments. I guess. I don't know. Thankfully, I never had to consider it.
You're doing exactly what you love to do. Name one thing that's still on your bucket list.
Well, there are some places on the globe that I'd like to travel. I'd like to go to New Zealand. I've spent time in Australia. It's common to hear, if you like Australia, you'll love New Zealand. I'd like to visit New Zealand. I'd like to spend more time than I have in Italy. I've spent a lot of time in France, but another trip to Paris is never a bad thing. My favorite Olympics of all the Olympics I did was Barcelona in 1992, maybe because it was my first one as the primetime host, so there was a certain thrill involved in that. But I'd like to return to Barcelona. It's a beautiful city. So that kind of travel. In sports, there really isn't anything that I haven't done that I'd like to do. Whatever I do going forward, and I've tapered off quite a bit, whatever I do going forward, I just want to make sure that it's all in the categories that mattered most to me. I don't want to waste any appearances on the air. I want to do baseball, and I want to do long-form interviews and programs apart from game coverage that have a commentary and journalism aspect to them.
Okay. Now, you've called countless baseball games. If you were a professional baseball player, what would your song be when you walked up to the plate?
Wow.
You've had to have thought about this at some point, right?
You know, I never have. I never have thought about it. What would it be? Well, you know, Ludacris is among the hip hop guys who has name checked me.
Okay.
So if I go with something that's a bit more up to date, although this goes back to around 2000 or 2001, there is a Ludacris lyric, some of which is unprintable or unmentionable, but luckily the part that references me can be spoken about on your program. And this line goes, "I'll be rolling torpedoes, get blunted with Rostas, and for a hefty fee I'm on your record, like Bob Costas." And the next line is, "I own so many jerseys, I'm a throwback mess. I hit the dry cleaner and get a full court press."
That's super cool.
So maybe Ludacris is my guy.
I've always been a big fan of his. Well, Bob Costas, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us on the All Me podcast. And from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of the organization, thank you for all you've done to support the Taylor Hooten Foundation over the years and the stance that you've taken against appearance and performance enhancing substances. And I hope once all this COVID mess is over that our lives in person will actually cross paths at some point.
I hope so too, Don. Best to you and your family. Happy holidays.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.